And the Strands. Chapter 5. Loosing. Cavil startled awake. His jaw was open, his mouth dry, his body slick with a cold sweat which had soaked through his yoga pants and his t-shirt, and soaked into the gown and the beanbag. As he tried to lift himself to sitting, he realized his right arm was draped above his head and totally numb. It took his left arm holding it by the wrist to flop it down to his lap. Rubbing it to aid blood flow, Cavil shuffled and struggled to his feet. The damp patch on his robe and the bag stretched its full length, and he wondered if he'd wet himself. Directly in front of him, the lava lamp's glass reflected his face as he watched, rubbing his arm, two perfectly round boluses of wax floating level with his eye sockets. Cavil showered, shaved, and drank a cup of green tea he didn't taste, dressed, and only then thought to check the time. He still had 2 hours before he needed to leave for the garage to make his habitual time. As he looked at the clock, he noticed a thin layer of dust on its top. For some reason, this irked him, and when he wiped it clean with a tissue, his eyes seemed to notice other neglected areas of his apartment. The next hour was spent dusting, sweeping, scrubbing. It helped occupy his mind, but there was a deeper urge he couldn't quite place. Cavil still arrived early, and threw himself into invoices and bills. He flew through administrative tasks he'd overlooked and neglected for quite a good while. It took until mid-morning, however, until the circulation to his right arm felt fully restored, and almost immediately afterwards, an ache began. It was a clawing, coying, needy ache, which seemed to originate in the ulnar bone itself. At midday, when he left his office to query an insurance detail on one of his drivers, the size, swelling, and colour of his arm drew 3 independent intakes of breath and queries. One asked if he'd torn a muscle, the second if he was having an allergic reaction, the third just tried to hide her shock, which was somehow worse. As the afternoon drew on, Cavil was having issues bending his arm, and when he decided he needed to remove his short-sleeve overshirt, he needed to split the seam of the short cuff and actively pull to free his arm, and found the cloth had dug a pressure pattern of stitches around his biceps. Cavil's first thought, naturally, was of the bottomless cavern, of the many dark, staring discs, the tentative steps, the shuffling fangs. His second thought, and what a sweet relief it brought, was of a circulation issue. He had simply let his arm develop pins and needles for too long. Hours, most likely. Of course it was now swelling up. A bit of ice, and it would be fine. If it wasn't going to go down tomorrow, he'd go to a doctor. But of course, it was nothing. Maybe it was psychosomatic. That evening, sitting in front of his tiny and mostly unused laptop, the lava lamp turned off and the beanbag kicked against a wall. Cavil attempted not to nod. He had lost count of how many coffees he had already had that day, and despite not being a habitual smoker of tobacco, he was strongly contemplating buying some. His robe was in the wash, and he couldn't have put it on anyway. The bag of ice he'd picked up balanced on his throbbing upper arm, pulsing, pulsing, pulsing. As Cavil's mind went swimmy, and thoughts which should have travelled in straight lines through the unities of space, time, and causality verged and moved into shapes and colours and repetitive contemplations, his arm popped. The pain was great, but it brought with it enormous relief. Cavil kicked himself to an upright sitting position and reached for the running dampness with his left hand. Whether it was the ice or some damage to the tissue, the flap didn't hurt much at all. Rather, it was the texture and the pressure he felt, as if with a burst blister, and the now excess skin, the tugging and the flapping of it. The fluid rang over the fingers of his left hand. But as he did, his nerves started to differentiate a different quality of movement. Tapping, or pattering, brushing, or stroking. Tentative. When he saw the ivory pink forms moving with their alternative pair of legs, reacting to his own movements, pausing to adapt their crouches to increase or decrease in the speed of his limbs, Cavil froze. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. As he sat, frozen in place, his face constricted in terror, one of them span slowly around, as if such a movement pattern were new to it, and looked right at him. Another one, close to his ear, made a noise to all the world that sounded like a giggle. He attempted to flail them off, but one of them leapt off its own accord and ran up his arm and out of his field of vision, but presumably onto his back. One with particularly long legs ran down his own leg. The largest of them simply rode it out, one hunkered down as if attempting to hide in the folds of his top, and the one which was looking right at him threw up two legs, one either side of its face, and skittered side to side as if to maintain balance. The last moment was so unexpected, Cavil paused, still again, but out of shock and incredulity rather than fear this time. The little one did it again, and this time muscles seemed to contract along the pink surface of its back. Cavil remained still and attempted to survey the situation. The scary one on his leg was at shin level. He couldn't feel its weight, and the way it lurked was unnerving to him, and as his reservations about it grew, he shifted to get a better view, realizing it to be even more arching, even more jagged in outline than first impression. The big one seemed content to sit there, as did the one inside the fold of his top. At first he thought it was a perspective, which marked it as bigger than the others, but now he took in the proportions fully. It did seem larger. The one which leapt was now on the wall opposite, and it too had rotated to look at him. Cavil met its gaze, and for the first time registered that it had a face, or at least half a face. Yes, they all had, he realized, as his eyes moved from one to the other, all except the big one. Yes, the one he thought of as the big one was definitely larger than the others. As he looked around again for the one he thought was comparatively cute, it was its giggle which told him it was now apparently preening in his lap. The faces were indeed doll-like, just as he thought, yet they returned to what one would expect around the lower jaw, where the chorillae and the fangs had the decency to return. They weren't attacking, yet. That was a good sign. And they were all pinkish and whitish smooth, almost like crabs, but they seemed squishier. Maybe they weren't much of a threat. Cavil's heart rate began to slow, and he swallowed. The cute one, which had been preening, moved over his thigh, where it seemed to meet up with the longer-legged one, and the two of them then left his body and began to traverse the floor and stood facing the lava lamp. Remembering, Cavil wheeled his head around to look for the one which he thought was headed to his back. As he did so, the large one and the hunkered down one both dropped off his arm and joined the other pair on the floor. When Cavil located what they were looking for, the one with the large abdomen, it was dangling between his legs from a single strand of webbing. It lowered itself to the floor, and Cavil found himself standing, arm-weeping clear plasma, surrounded by 6 creatures, varying in size and proportion, but all unmistakably hailing from the same mother. Cavil took a deep breath, swallowed again. He felt the pain of a suddenly full bladder. Cavil didn't know what on earth to do. He was so petrified he didn't even attempt to swat or crush them. Most of them stood motionless. The large one shovelled its fangs. He counted. The one which raised its legs and scuttled side to side, smaller than the rest, more rounded. For the first time it seemed as though it was sparkling a little. And Cavil noticed there were wispy, feathery strands on its back, which were iridescent blue where the light caught them. The one which dropped down between Cavil's legs wasn't particularly large, but it had a large, roundish abdomen with visible spinners nubbing out like a tail. The horrid, arched one, with its needle-like legs and long oblong, was noticeably darker in shade than the others, and Cavil wondered if it were venomous. And then, as it turned to face him, he noticed a faint, jagged red splash along its back. Its face was, like the others, chalk white and human-ish until roughly the lower lip, where the chorillae served as a poor lower jaw replacement, and which only seemed to suggest a lower lip until they twitched. The venomous-looking one's face, however, seemed set in something more like a scream or a howl than a simple doll-like blackness. The one which jumped had long, thick legs, and its mask had something of a hyper, overexcited, puppy-like expression, more snout and canine than the others. The one which huddled down close to the cloth of Cavill's top was low-slung, well-proportioned, and from the angle Cavill noted that it too had pronounced spinners poking out. 6. As he tried to identify and differentiate among them, he noticed they weren't actually all pink. They were different colours. What if he made a break for it? Cavill took a step back. All 6 immediately advanced. Cavill froze. They all stopped. The large one, which seemed somehow rounded and less pointy than several of the others, which prevented him from being as terrifying as it could be, was the last to stop, and rose up, partly rampant, extending one foreleg and stroking the air in Cavill's direction. Cavill took a second step. They all immediately scurried forward, and stopped as soon as Cavill's own step faltered. The pretty one giggled. Cavill's eyes moved to meet its gaze, and as he did so, he realized that just as he'd been examining, gauging, and taking them in, it seemed now as if they had been doing the same to him. The giggling continued, and the flat, hunkered downward emitted a similar sound, but lower, throatier, like a chuckle. Cavill's apartment was mostly open plan, and his main room, which also doubled as the room he slept in when he was indulging in augmented dreaming or vision quests, as the beanbag was a safer place to sleep than his bed. The vomiting and choking risk was much lower. It led into a small kitchen. Cavill noticed that within 2, maybe 3 steps he could reach the main cupboard which served as a pantry. Food. He'd distract them. He tried to reach back with his still dripping arm, trying to keep his eyes on 6 often quizzically tilting white masks. Cavill grabbed the first thing his fingertips met, a jar of Argave syrup. Perhaps he could pour it on them and trap them, drown them. As the thought bubbled up in his mind, a white static akin to aphasia slowly crept through his mind, and the pain of his bladder suddenly kicked up a notch. Like cooling wax, the thought sunk back down into his unconscious. The jar popped open. Cavill knelt and poured a large gloop into the lid, laying it on the tiled floor. There was an intake of breath, followed by soft scampering. All 6 nuzzled in a circle around the amber liquid, sighing, suckling. They would eat food. Oh, thank God. He would get a tank, something to contain them. He had pets now, that was all. He could do some reading on the internet. Maybe this had happened to someone else. He did seem to remember stories of people being bitten by things and having eggs implanted in them. Of course, that's all that had happened. He'd been bitten in his sleep. The dream was his unconscious mind responding to it. It was going to be okay. Then he heard it, clacking. Smaller, softly, possibly a little sticky in quality from the syrup, but it was unmistakable. They'd formed a semicircle again. Cavill held up his arms in a "whoa" gesture, hoping to cause them to freeze again, and noticed that several of them were also pulling their faces and upper lips back in a "whoa" shape. Cavill lowered his arm and attempted a mirthless, humorless, joyless smile. 4 icing sugar-coated rictuses were returned, and the small one threw up 2 legs and skittered from side to side. The leggy one liked to jump on walls around waist height. The low-slung one liked to get somewhere behind under cover where he'd peer out, sometimes myopically. The large one seemed to just like to be the center of the others, and the little one always wanted to be the closest to him. The sinister one lurked at the back, like an uncomfortable reminder that any of them, or all of them, could be poisonous for all Cavill knew. The rotund one used webbing to hang from anything and everything. What was clear was that they wanted to follow him around his apartment, and were extremely interested in whatever it was he was doing. When he attempted to close the bathroom door on them, they just squeezed underneath. Similarly, and very uncomfortably, when he attempted to use the bathroom alone, he found himself sitting on the toilet to pee, his yoga pants pulled up as high as possible, watching while the round one drew thin strands of webbing from the bottom of one towel to the door frame. Maybe they were thirsty. Cavill leant over the sink, still seated, and filled his cupped hand with tap water. They all scurried around the little well, and sighed and purred again, several little forelegs extending to stroke his fingertips. Back in the bedroom, Cavill sat on his bed, and propped himself up on a pillow. Checking the clock, he realized it was now either very late or very early, depending on one's perspective. He had booked the day off tomorrow, citing his arm as a reason. Not that it mattered, it was down to him anyway, and he was thankful. It gave him a whole day to what? Find a tank? Find the nerve to grab them one by one? Get a net? Call an exterminator? As the thought of an exterminator formed in his mind, a soft sinking feeling took him by the base of his neck, and blind spots of black swam before his eyes, possibly due to fluid loss caused by his arm, and the thought broke apart like a cloud, leaving no trace. Buy some more syrup. Yes, maybe if they like syrup, or maybe some jam. Eggs. The clutch had drawn nearer as Cavil stared into space. One was busying itself, forming a collection of strands between the legs of the table bedside. Another was hunkered down under a cushion, beady eyes peering out. The dark, needle-legged one lurked under the horizon of the mattress, only occasionally raising its head as if to check on what was going on. The one with thick legs was practicing jumping from the bed to the wall and back again. The big one squatted motionless, a roughly equal distance between them all. But this time Cavil noticed the positioning included himself, as if it was on guard. When Cavil's eyes refocused again, he was still very much out of it. He noticed the little one was sitting on his knee, looking directly up at his face. It was doll-like in the face, and the two largest forward-facing eyes were curved on this one side, increasing the human likeness. And it had, Cavil noticed for the first time, surely they'd not grown since he'd last examined it. Long, thick, kiss-curled eyelashes. It threw out two of its arms and raised a wispy plume of thin, royal blue-coloured hair from the back of its tiny peacock. Cavil breathed a laugh, despite himself, despite the damp patches under his arms and on his lower back, despite the crusting, oozing flap on his arm. Pretty, Cavil said to himself. The fluffed-up little parcel of eyes, legs, and feathers pitter-patted its feet in apparent excitement. Pretty, it breathed back, and giggled.